Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Platonic Soul, and I hope you've been well. In the last couple of episodes, you might remember I've been looking at how, through the 19th century and beyond, as the inquiring spirit of the Enlightenment with its sciences continued to transform Western society, what you might call these sort of cultural elites seem to increasingly think of existential oneness this these states that had previously been seen as mystical states. These people increasingly started to see them in secular terms. And I think we can see this happening both subjectively and objectively. And here's what I mean by this. When I say subjectively, I mean that some of those who experience these phenomena start to use secular terms to describe the experience as, for example, as a state of oneness with the cosmos and the self, or the absolute reality, rather than with God. And by objectively, I mean that scientists were now starting to look at them as real, as natural psychological phenomena with presumably natural causes that might play, and to speculate about what role they might play in the organism. Anyway, I think it's fair to say that in the 20th century, especially the second half of it, this trend really mushroomed or kind of exploded to the point where today, while on the one hand religion in the West seems in decline, I think it's fair to say that oneness is really a kind of holy grail for us. It often seems like it's almost the great quest of our time. And I think it's also fair to say that this trend of seeing unitive experience as a natural human need has also grown. It's too rich and complicated a story for me to do justice to in just one episode, but I'm hoping to be able to sort of skip through it because I think the way it happened is so interesting. I think when most of us think of what you could call the history of oneness or of altered states of consciousness in the second half of the 20th century, I think most people would think of these things as really sort of taking off in the late 60s, early 70s, with the explosion of interest in psychedelic drugs and the adoption of Eastern practices like meditation, yoga, mindfulness generally. We sort of think of that period, the late 60s, early 70s, as sort of the classic era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, this sort of triad of unitive quests. But it's interesting how these historical eras work. We talked about how even though people typically see, well, the Enlightenment as happening generally in the 17th and 18th centuries, but in a way it never ended because it's going on until today. I think it's the same with these discoveries and obsessions of the late 60s and early 70s. We see that as the classic era of the birth of people's obsessions with these things. But these obsessions never really stopped. They've really continued on to our own time, and if anything, I think have just become sort of more mainstream. Anyway, on the other hand, the other interesting thing is that on the other hand, we tend to see the 50s and early 60s sort of the opposite, of, like sort of psychically staid time. We tend to, at least partly, I think, stereotype it as this age of cultural and psychological or mental conformism. And it does sort of seem like the sort of the golden age of ordinary consciousness, and it is often ridiculed in various ways for that. But I think it's fair to say that there were signs of this later obsessiveness with unitive states already in this earlier period of the 50s and early 60s. And I'd like to talk a bit about that today. So, for example, when it comes to the interest in consciousness altering drugs, we have not just the interest of the first modern psychologists, as we saw with William James and laughing gas around the turn of the century. We also have the beginning of popular interest in psychedelia starting to show up as early as the early 50s. That's when the writer Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, came out. And it's about his experiences using mescaline and the reflections on consciousness that this experience spurred in him. Huxley believed the drug allowed users to glimpse reality in a way that leaves their consciousness unbounded by the restrictions that abstractive thought seems to put on it. As we saw a couple of episodes ago, this striving to grasp reality in a more immediate way than reason seems to go back to Romanticism. And actually, an interesting thing about Huxley's book is that he borrowed the title of it from a line in the Romantic poet William Blake's book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was published in 1790. And here's the line: if the doors of perception were cleansed of everything, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite, for man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. Huxley's book was controversial at the time, but it seems in a way the ideas in it needed a period of germination before taking fruit in popular culture, as these things often seem to. But they did eventually, as we saw with this explosion of interest in psychedelic drugs later in the 60s. And sort of spreading through popular culture with, for example, the band The Doors, according to Jim Morrison, when they were formed in 1965, borrowed their name from the title of Huxley's book. So he borrowed it from Blake, and this concept of a door into a expanded consciousness. Huxley borrowed it from Blake, and the Doors borrowed it from Huxley. So these things that seem sort of radical actually they're following this tradition, which is also interesting. Anyway, there's another work I'd like to mention from this supposed time of everyday consciousness, which is less well known, but also quite interesting, I think. It's called Ecstasy in Secular and Religious Experiences, and that was published in 1961. The author of that was Margarita Lasky, an English journalist and novelist. She was also a professed atheist, actually. But she was so curious about ecstasies that she did a massive research project into them. She wasn't a trained psychologist, but she just planned and executed this research project entirely, it seems, on her own initiative. Like, she drew up questionnaires and distributed them and did everything she could to find people who had had ecstasies. So that they could be sort of categorized, and the various aspects of them could be sort of cataloged. She analyzes them with respect to a variety of categories, like what triggered them, how intense they were, the duration, and what the person experiencing them had felt they had lost or gained. And another interesting thing about this book and the historical setting of it, you may remember in our last episode we talked about this trend in William James's time of pathologizing these phenomena, or sort of reducing them to other natural phenomena. We saw Freud doing that, for example. It seems pretty clear this attitude continued to Lasky's time. Maybe it was fed by Freudianism, because she too actually talks about a tendency at the time to reduce them to, quote, a phenomenon of repressed sexuality, or only a concomitant of some or other morbid condition. But Lasky writes that the results of her surveys seem to suggest that these states, as James had speculated, play an adaptive role in human life, that they involve a sort of mental reorganization of the mind that seems to improve our normal everyday cognition by sort of jogging it out of the ruts that it has a tendency to fall into and enhancing our creativity. Here's what she writes. The related pattern, this is near the end of her book, the related pattern of loss and gain and the nature of the gains felt to have been made as a result of ecstatic experiences leads me to suppose that in these experiences we have a loss of the normal sense of relationships by which we assess our perceptions, and a regaining of that sense of relationships in improved form, and that ecstatic experiences are manifestations, probably exaggerated manifestations, of processes facilitating improved mental organization. And she admits to this really being speculation on her part. It's generally agreed that ecstatic experiences are to be valued not for the delight they give, which is great, but for their beneficial results. These results may be generally expressed as improved mental organization, whether this takes the form of replacing uneasiness and dissatisfaction with ease and satisfaction, or of appearing to confirm a sought belief, or of inspiring to moral action, or of enabling the expression of a new mental creation. And near the end of the book, she concludes, I do not think it is sensible to ignore, as most rationalists have done, ecstatic experiences and the emotions and ideas to which they give rise. To ignore or deny the importance of ecstatic experiences is to leave to the irrational the interpretation of what many people believe to be of supreme value. This seems like it could be aimed at Freud, among many others. You may remember he seemed at once very interested in these states, but ultimately sort of dismissive of them. And he talked about wanting to be in the clear light of dawn. He felt that studying them was like studying something inherently murky. Anyway, she continues, I do not believe that to seek a rational explanation of these experiences is in any way to denigrate them, but rather that a rational explanation may prove at least as awe-inspiring as earlier interpretations. So I think it's fair to say that Margarita Lasky isn't really very well known today. But her speculations on ecstasy seem to have been taken up by someone who has been more obviously influential, especially, I think, in popular psychology. And that's the American psychologist Abraham Maslow. You may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's often depicted as a pyramid, although apparently he never used the images of the pyramid himself. He's also known because he developed a lot of theories around what he called peak experiences in his book, Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences. And that was published in 1964, but it was actually based on research he'd been doing since the 40s. And again, with that book, you can see what we could call this complete secularization of mysticism. He actually cites Lasky's book. He speculates that mystic experiences, which he says are being, quote, eagerly investigated by many psychologists in his own time, are entirely natural phenomena, which he prefers to class them all under this term peak experiences. These sort of mystical experiences, but also secular ecstasies. He wants to bring them all under this umbrella of peak experiences. Anyway, for Maslow, these experiences, they're necessary for us to achieve this self-transcendence that I'm not sure how much this is demonstrated by empirical research, but he puts self-transcendence at the top of his hierarchy of needs. And this actually has to do with his division of human cognition into two classes. The everyday, which he calls decognition, because he sees it as based on deficiency. It's the kind of thinking that we all do to satisfy our needs, to figure out how we're going to get the things that we want. So he distinguishes that from what he calls be cognition, which is cognition of being as it is, being as such. And he sees that as necessary for our transcendence to sort of reach the top of the pyramid, which he never actually visualized it that way, but he saw it as at the top of the hierarchy of needs. So he writes that people need this be cognition to discover purpose for themselves. He writes, the peaker learns surely and certainly that life can be worthwhile, that it can be beautiful and valuable. There are ends in life, i.e., experiences which are so precious in themselves as to prove that not everything is a means to some end other than itself. Like Lasky, Maslow also believes these experiences seem to play a role in improving our everyday cognition. And he actually went on from, eventually he also started talking about plateau experiences, because he believed that the effects of the peak often continued beyond the actual experience itself. But anyway, he writes that this be cognition involves a shift, quote, in the organization of perception, in noticing or realizing, and, quote, a freshening of experience and the breaking up of rubricizing. So the breaking up of the rigid categories that we often form in everyday life. Here he is again. Familiarization dulls cognition, especially in anxious people. And it is then possible to walk through all sorts of miraculous happenings without experiencing them as such. I just think this is so interesting, because we see Blake here, we see Whitman, we see Proust. But it's a scientist, even though not all of his methods would. I'm not sure how much modern psychologists would approve of his methods. They may see them as somewhat unscientific. In peaks, the miraculous suchness of things can break through into consciousness. This is a basic function of art and could be studied in that realm also. This kind of innocent perception is described in one of my articles. It's a kind of perspicuity which contrasts with what can only be called normal blindness. So this innocent perception, which sounds so Blakean to me, it's unitive or immediate, and it's somehow about reception rather than abstraction. He also calls it Taoistic after the Chinese philosophy. Here's Maslow again. Non-interfering, receptive Taoistic perception is necessary for the perception of certain kinds of truth. Peak experiences are states in which striving, interfering, and active controlling diminish, thereby permitting Taoistic perception, thereby diminishing the effect of the perceiver upon the percept. So that's how supposedly we're able to see things in some way in themselves, because we're not trying to read anything into them, basically. Therefore, truer knowledge of some things may be expected and has been reported. I think it's a huge question whether the cognition that people have in these states can really be called knowledge. And I think that's something that we'll get into later. Anyway, like William James, Maslow was also interested in the role of drugs in bringing these experiences about, and he actually anticipates a time when science will be able to use them to study peak experiences, because they obviously have this advantage. Typically, these ecstasies come about, or often, sort of out of the blue. They're not something that people control, whereas I think starting with Maslow and many others, it's sort of thought that drugs make the study of these states much easier because they're much more, you determine basically when the state is going to begin. So they're easier to study in a lab. Here's what he writes. In the last few years, it has become quite clear that certain drugs called psychedelic, especially LSD and psilocybin, give us some possibility of control in this realm of peak experiences. It looks as if these drugs often produce peak experiences in the right people under the right circumstances, so that perhaps we needn't wait for them to occur by good fortune. Perhaps we can actually produce a private, personal peak experience under observation and whenever we wish, under religious or non-religious circumstances. We may then be able to study, in its moment of birth, the experience of illumination or revelation. So this was in a book published in 1964. Maslow may have been disappointed if he had known how long it would take for science to really start studying these effects in the lab in earnest, I think he'd probably be disappointed. But on the other hand, I think it's fair to say that the findings that have been made in this regard in the last couple of decades are really quite amazing. And I'd actually like to look at them in our next episode. Anyway, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.